Welcome to the CRC Award Program, OER Award Program Backward Design Workshop. If you'd like to access the slides, there is a link on the page. And for those of you that are here, I will attempt to put that in the chat for you. There we go. Okay. So you're likely here because you plan to participate in the CRC OER Award Program, or if you're not, maybe you heard about this backward design workshop through various professional development channels. Either way, welcome. Before we start talking about actually using OER in our courses, I think it's helpful, at least it's been helpful for me to look at our course design from a different perspective. Backward design is a planning framework that can help you both figure out what your course is going to look like if you're planning on revamping it. And then also it can help you with the selection of content for your course. So the objectives for today's workshop are to, one, define backward design. What is backwards design? And then to describe the process of backward design and to talk a little bit about how we can use backward design in the development of both online and face-to-face courses. And our last objective of the day is to identify how we can use backward design to help us curate and or create open educational resources. Because as I mentioned before, this workshop is part of a series of workshops for the CRC OER Award Program. Okay, so what is backward design? Raise your hands if you have heard of backward design before. I don't see any hands raising. Okay, so backward design is a planning framework. It's not really a teaching philosophy because backward design is something that should be happening before we even get into the classroom or before we open up our online courses and Canvas to our students. Typically, when we design a course or we start thinking about what we're going to be teaching, we often start with the content, right? We select the textbook, we figure out what's going to be in our PowerPoint slides, then we design the assessments around what we've built for lecturing. Backward design is different than that. It's like the exact opposite. The idea is to design with the long-term goals in mind. So you want to think about what your learning outcomes are, what your final goals are for the class, and then embed those long-term goals in your short-term plans. For example, if critical thinking is your long-term goal, then when you plan the course, you want to make sure that you focus on critical and creative use of the content. And so the activities that involve critical thinking would be embedded in your weekly learning materials as well as in your assessments. I find that this flowchart here is helpful because it shows how we typically progress through our course, right? Activities and then assessment and then we assess those learning outcomes. But really backward design is going in the opposite direction, right? So identifying your learning outcomes, then your assessments, and finally your learning materials. I like to look at it with questions. I think using questions helps us identify what these three steps sort of involve. So the three key decisions that you would make if you were using backward design is first, what do I want my students to learn? And those are your outcomes, right? So what is it that I want my students to have as in their toolkit, in their quiver of skills when they leave my class? Secondly, how will the students and me know that they are learning? And so this is where the assessments come into play. This is how they judge their progress and how I judge their progress. And then finally, I can plan the learning experiences based on what I want them to learn and help them identify what they need to do in order to learn that material. And so the last part, which is, you know, the development of the content and the learning activities, that comes at the very end. And I know that seems really weird. It seems very backward, right? Design your assessments before you actually find out what, you know, YouTube videos you're going to use. Yep, that's exactly what we're talking about. So I want to start off our exploration of backward design with a question. What do you want your students to learn? Take 15 to 30 seconds, however long you need, to write a brief mission statement for your course. And if you hear random clicking noises in the background, that's my dog pacing with her long toenails. All right, so have you had an opportunity to write a mission statement for your course? And may I get someone to share? Any volunteers? Okay, no volunteers. Well, that's all right. Lucky for you. I developed one for myself. So here is my goal for my introductory anatomy and physiology course, right? So I want students to understand how the human body works. Is this goal measurable? Give me a thumbs up or a thumbs down. If students were to look at this statement, would they understand what I'm wanting them to do? Would they know how they can measure their own success? What do you think? Yep, I see some handshaking. Right, so this goal doesn't have any measurable outcomes. It doesn't identify how students will know if they're learning and how I will check to see if they're learning. So one of the first steps to backward design, and really any kind of assessment design, is to think about the measurable outcomes. These are also referred to as like the action verbs associated with Bloom's taxonomy. How many have you have heard of Bloom's taxonomy before? Can you give me like a thumbs up or a head nod? I'm going to venture a guess, since I've got some absolute rock stars here, that you guys have already heard of Bloom's taxonomy.
Can I step in for just a minute?
Yeah.
So
sure.
When you go through the OEI, you have to use Bloom's in order to do your objectives. So I'm very familiar with them.
Yes, yes. And in fact, every person in attendance at this workshop has also been through the OEI alignment process. So as I mentioned before, you guys are all rock stars. You already know about Bloom's taxonomy and measurable outcomes. But this is a key component of the success of course and assessment design, right? Is to understand what level of learning your objectives are at, and to understand and to identify some words that you, or terms that you can use to convey to students how they will demonstrate their learning, and also to help you identify whether your assessments align with those levels of learning. So this particular graphic I find very helpful, and I've shared a link to the PDF file that I just dropped in my Google Drive, but you can always get it from the link on the presentation if you're accessing the presentation as well right now. And so when we look at our curriculum, our course outline of records, there are the student learning outcomes that have been identified either by us if we wrote it, or if we're the one responsible for updating the course outline of record, or by a colleague. And so we can use those action verbs that are in the learning outcomes of the course outline of record to help us identify some of our major skills that we want students to be able to demonstrate, and the level of learning and the expression of that learning can be sort of gleaned by from those action verbs. So after I wrote this one, I thought about, okay, well, it's not measurable. So let's try these instead. Let's see how I did. Did I get to a point where I can measure the outcome? So in my introductory anatomy and physiology course, I want students to leave this course with the ability to communicate with medical professionals about their health and the health of others, and apply their understanding of physiological processes when making decisions about their health and the health of others. So are there measurable outcomes in these? I see a thumbs up. I see, yeah, okay. Yeah, I'm with you, Marjorie. I kind of struggled with this first one. Oops, sorry. I struggled with the first one, the communicate. And I think that communicate actually is okay as a measurable outcome because we can translate communicate to explain and describe. So essentially, when you're communicating with a medical professional, you're explaining or you're describing your symptoms or the patient's symptoms. And so I think that that element can be met with measurable outcomes. And then applying the understanding of physical processes. Well, I did use the word apply. We've still got that understanding in there that's problematic, but the application component helps us identify what level of learning we're looking at, right? So this one right in the middle. Now, these are not all the learning outcomes for my course. These are just two that I thought, related to demonstrate an understanding of the human body. Okay. So outcomes are definitely important. And we certainly are going to be using those in backward design. And if you're doing an OEI alignment process, you're going to be leaning on those outcomes and those objectives heavily. In the process of planning this workshop, I came across something else, which I wanted to share with you because I found it really interesting. And it is called significant learning. It's a framework that identifies levels of learning, some of which overlap with Bloom's taxonomy, foundational knowledge, application, integration. But Fink suggests that significant learning cannot take place unless there are other elements beyond the sort of textbook knowledge components that we usually think about with learning. And that is learning how to learn, right? So becoming a confident learner and consumer of information so that students can continue to learn when we're not there to guide them. So I thought that was a really interesting one. I know that when I first started teaching biology, I thought I shouldn't have to teach my students how to be a student. Coming right out of grad school, they should know how to do this. It's like, wait a minute, do I know how to be a good student? So learning how to learn is a skill that we can give students, and it also will help them feel more confident about their experience in your course, their other courses in their academic and professional careers. Other components of significant learning that I think would help with backward design and course design in general are to think about facilitating learning that fosters engagement. So the students care about what they're learning. They can identify why they need to be learning that, the big, why am I learning this? So fostering that caring for the content, and then also encouraging students to make connections between the content and themselves or other people. And that's the human dimension. And instructors that have that human dimension and that caring and that learning how to learn usually have successful outcomes because students are fully engaged and they care about the content and they can relate it to their lives. And we'll see this come up again in just a few minutes when I talk more about the sort of steps of backward design and dive into that a little bit more. But I'd like to pause for a moment if you guys have any questions or comments about, would like to add to what I've talked about so far based on your experiences. Okay, I'm going to take that silence as the permission to proceed. Okay, so back to this flowchart. Okay, this flowchart, same one as before. I've just organized it differently because I tend to often think in terms of hierarchies, just a biology thing, maybe, I don't know. But this is the same basic stages of backwards design, but here we've identified them in the sort of steps, right? So understanding how we can design a course using backward design can also help ensure that we are efficient with our selection of course materials, especially when you're stepping away from using a textbook. It really helps to have an idea of where you're headed in the class before you start looking at OER. Otherwise, you just like dive into all the OER and get so distracted and bogged down with all the possibilities. So if we first, once again, identify our results and our assessments, then that will help us with the content curation. So let's start off with identifying the desired results. I found this really wonderful website, and I've referred to it before, even before this particular, planning this particular workshop. And backward design is based on this concept of understanding by design. And I've included the link here in the PowerPoint for you to access the full understanding by design resource, and also 2 videos that are filmed by one of the professors that developed this idea or this planning framework in the first place. And so when we talk about identifying desired results, our learning outcomes, it's important, I think, that we refer to the course outline of record because we are obligated to teach to those learning outcomes, right? But also that we think about sort of the big picture stuff. So this graphic here, I think, is very helpful because it helps kind of divide up our learning, our students' learning, into 3 categories. The first category or set of objectives would be like what students should hear, read, explore, or otherwise encounter. So this is like the familiarity, right? And a lot I know from my experience teaching biology that I often throw in content and information that I would, think they might like to know, but can be very confusing for them from a student perspective. Like, why did she include that? Is that required? So we definitely want to make clear to students essentially what is worth being familiar with. And then we also want to make sure that we're clear with ourselves and with our students what is important for them to know and to do. What knowledge and skills should they master or have when they leave our course? And those are often the ones that are in the learning outcomes. And then this is where the significant learning comes into play, I think, is what are the big ideas? What are the important understandings and sort of enduring understanding that participants should retain that they can then take outside of that particular curriculum and apply that to other aspects of their academic, personal, or professional lives. And this purple circle, the enduring understanding, may not necessarily be in our outcomes, but again, we are helping form and educate the future voters and citizens of this of this world. And so the enduring understanding aspect is probably worth considering, even if it's not necessarily on your course outline of record. So the step 2 or stage 2 of your backward design planning process is determining the acceptable evidence. This is where you design the evaluations or the assessments to determine whether students have met those desired results. And again, when designing assessments, it's helpful to make sure that they align with the outcomes. And my immediate audience today, you all know this, having gone through the OEI alignment process, that our assessments must align with our objectives, our course objectives and our unit objectives. But for those of you who may be watching this in a recording later on, we definitely want to make sure that there is an alignment there, that our assessments are assessing or evaluating the outcomes. And when we develop assessments using the backward design framework, we want to focus on summative assessments first. Summative assessments are those high stakes assessments, and we'll talk more about what that means, but these are like the big projects of your course. I've provided some resources here OER Commons is a really great resource to find inspiration for assessments. And in fact, let's see if I can click on this and show you essentially how OER Commons works if you're not familiar with it. So let's say that I want to look up something on the scientific method, and I want to make sure that it is at community college level. I can do a search, and then I can filter based on material type. And so I can go in here and I can look up assessments and locate some sample assessments that, you know, I may not necessarily want to use immediately, but they could be useful to inspire my own work in developing assessments. And so that's part of the reason why I included the OER Commons on this slide, is because not that, you know, I suggest that you copy the assessments that you find there, but they can be really good creative examples of summative assessments beyond the traditional examination, multiple choice test or something like that. Okay, so when we're ensuring that our assessments are aligned with the objectives, right, you can refer to Bloom's taxonomy. I also wanted to share with you a couple of other resources that I picked up from AQ, and I got their permission to share these with you. And these are, again, linked in the PowerPoint, and if you'd like, I can share the links in the chat. This one is another way of looking at Bloom's taxonomy. I found this one really helpful because it has even more verbs on it than the other Bloom's taxonomy that I shared with you. And then this one is also very helpful when identifying, oops, did I do the same thing twice? Oh, here we go. This particular document is helpful because it provides example types of assessment. And so when we think about our different levels of learning, right, from sort of basic knowledge to the highest level of creation and synthesis, this table identifies some examples of assessments that could be used to assess that level of learning. Just a starting point, really. So I hope you find those useful. I got permission from AQ to share them with you today. All right, so now that we've designed our summative assessments, we've identified, okay, I want to have a portfolio project that students will be presenting their work at the end of the semester. And it's a collection of works that they've created over the course of the semester. And this will, you know, demonstrate their knowledge and their ability to apply and integrate and synthesize this information, let's say. So then once I've identified the summative assessments, then we can start working on the actual learning experiences, which as, you know, as community college instructors, we're subject matter experts. This is our bread and butter, right? We are really good at this part. We are really good at finding content, curating videos and imagery and documentaries or books to help reinforce the student's learning. But this is the part that is, you know, can be the most time consuming, and we can often lose the forest for the trees, if you will, if this is where we start. So once we have identified our objectives, our outcomes, excuse me, for the course and the summative assessments, then we can start on the content. And if you're curating OER, this is essentially where you would start after you've already decided what their final product of the class is going to be. And so we can use existing content or adapt or create our own content to help support the learning and the demonstration of those objectives. Obviously, you know, like PowerPoints like this one, you know, handouts, videos, even formative assessments. These are also learning activities. Formative assessments are like these low stakes assessments that help students get ongoing feedback on their progress, and it also helps build their mastery of the objectives towards the final summative assessments. And it also helps you get feedback on your students' progress. So if you need to like take a step back and be like, oh, that didn't really work so well, maybe I'm going to try this next time, or maybe I need to add some additional resources in to supplement their learning on top of what I already expected to be using. So this curation and creation of the learning activities and the resources is something we're going to be talking more about in future workshops. So I'm just going to put a plug in for next week's workshop. I believe it's next week, is to talk about some of the sort of more common, more bigger scale OERs that are available that have a lot of resources for a variety of different disciplines. And most of the ones that I'm going to talk about are ones that we already kind of know are accessible to students who may use screen readers, for example. So I'm not going to talk about that too much today unless you have specific questions, but those are some good places to start when you're looking for learning resources for content and also for formative assessments. Many of these actually have formative assessments built right in with the content itself that you can use if you want to. So let's talk a little bit more about assessment types. So assessment types, we talked both about summative assessments and formative assessments. So the summative assessments are the ones that, if we're using backward design, these are the ones that we're going to work on first, because the summative assessments will be evaluating or assessing students' demonstration of the course learning objectives. So the higher order thinking stuff, usually higher order learning, I should say, stuff. And so this includes things like term projects, midterm projects, final projects, portfolios of work, for example, writing work, poetry work, photography, art, that kind of stuff. And presentations, group presentations or individual presentations, papers, and of course, the objective exams. I put exams kind of last on the list because as you proceed through backward design and you identify your outcomes and how you're going to assess them, we often find that the exams don't actually align all that much, usually with the higher level of learning. Exams are often the sort of lower level on the Bloom's taxonomy, and those usually aren't defined in the course level outcomes. So the focus when developing a course using backward design is often on something called authentic assessments, assessments that that are aligned with the learning outcomes of the course and give the students an opportunity to engage with the content and to demonstrate real world transfer, that they can actually apply what they're learning to a real world situation in a way that is more authentic than answering a multiple choice question. So those are some examples of summative assessments. Formative assessments would be built right in with your content. These are frequent and usually involve some kind of self-assessment on a student's progress, either metacognitive self-assessment where they're thinking about how they're learning and identifying where they need more assistance and where they're really excelling. Or content-related self-assessments like practice quizzes or reflective journals, current events, comprehension checks, discussions even, or peer review. And so these low stakes assessments help build students up to the summative or high stakes assessments and also provide them with frequent feedback on their progress. And when you're developing your courses, when you're developing your weekly activities, it's really a great idea to have those built right in with the content. They don't have to be worth much. They could have automatic feedback in some cases, if like a quiz, for example. It's not an intention to like bog you down with a lot of grading, but that kind of feedback is really helpful for students. Okay, so the last sort of slide that I have for this presentation today is how I kind of envisioned the workflow of combining backward design with your work on curating and creating OER and where exactly the OER component would fit in, because again, this is part of the OER Award Program Workshop Series. So again, our first component of backward design is to identify the outcomes. And those are, of course, going to be described for you in your course outline of record. So that's a good place to start. And then to develop the summative assessments with your course and with your course SLOs in mind. This is a great time to consult OER, like OER Commons, for examples. And this is also a good time as you're developing your summative assessment to think about the significant learning component, right? Think about how we can develop assessments that help students engage with the content on a deeper, more personal level, rather than just a knowledge and application level. Make it personal. Once you have identified your summative assessments, that's when you start thinking about your modules or your weekly lectures. And this is before you even start with the PowerPoint, start with what the objectives are. What do you want your students to get out of that week of material? And then create your content and align it with those unit level objectives. Creating the content, once again, you know, if you are developing a course and it's all you, right? There's not really a lot of other resources available for your discipline. And so you're inventing the wheel. You can share that stuff that you've developed as OER, either on Canvas Commons or OER Commons. There are lots of options there. Or if there are resources available, this is where you can curate that stuff. And I can tell you from my zero textbook cost biology course, I did a lot of curation because I found that I wasn't really capable of creating a 3D animation of cellular respiration. It was really hard. So I relied a lot on content that was available for educational use, maybe not necessarily open, but available for me to use in my classes. And again, during the process of developing the content and the summative assessments, once again, we want to think about that significant learning component. How can we engage students deeply on a personal level or on a community level with the content that they're learning, and give them opportunities to engage with each other about the content, if that makes sense. Okay, so we're finishing up a little bit early. But I'd like to hear from you all. Have you used backward design before? Have you tried it? And how did it go? I'd love to have some personal stories added to the archive of this recording if you've got them and you want to share.
I can share, Jenna.
Thank you.
I apologize. I have been scrambling for the last 45 minutes trying to get one computer in my house to work. There's multiple, but I don't know the passwords to any of the other ones.
Oh no.
Here, and so I've been frantically texting him. So, little side note, my computer is crashing right now in the office, and so I'm doing this on my phone. But as far as backward design, I think it just makes your life so much easier when you're not only trying to think about what you want your students to learn, but in assessment, it's incredibly powerful when you're trying to actually measure if they've learned what you want them to learn. So my experience with it, I was lucky because in some ways I was lucky because I created a class from scratch, which was not part of our department or the district. And so I really had to kind of do it all on my own, but that was really, really hard. But I used backward design throughout it. So I had to create the learning outcomes for the entire course and then come up with outcomes for each individual unit and really thinking about how I was going to measure those and what kind of assignments were going to help the students. I didn't want a bunch of rote memorization. I wanted them to actually gain these skills to be able to become better researchers and critical thinkers. And so thinking about things that way it makes it much more powerful. And I think thinking about your outcomes and making sure that they're measurable, I think that is sometimes very challenging. And often, even with my class, after the first iteration, I had to kind of go back in and do some revision because I realized things weren't as clear as I had hoped they would be. And even sometimes you'll find with assignments that what you are wanting them to learn, it becomes very clear with what they've turned in that they're just not getting it. And so you have to kind of rework things and revise things, and understanding that that's a process and it's okay if you don't get it right the first time, but to just keep trying. That would be my recommendation.
Thank you. Thank you, Andy. And your class is really a fabulous example of assessments being aligned with the objectives and authentic assessment. I felt myself really wanting to engage in the assignments, even though I wasn't a student. It's like, wow, I really want to do this. This is great. So yeah, I think that having the benefit of starting from scratch really makes backward design a lot easier. Most of us who are coming to this workshop with a class already in mind, a class that we're currently teaching, that we've built around a textbook, perhaps, that's when it becomes really challenging, because it is hard to scrap all that stuff that you've already built. It's hard to walk away from that and decide that you're going to start all over. It doesn't mean that all of that stuff that you built isn't going to end up being useful, but it will help you go through and sift through all the content and the lectures and the videos and the assessments, and really identify whether they're important for keeping because they do help students towards the final goal of the course, or if they're just kind of like, hey, this is an FYI sort of thing, maybe I just include that and tag that on at the end as an additional resource. Yeah. I see a comment in the chat. So yeah, okay, so I got a question in the chat. Would be interested in seeing an example of an actual objective and activity or an assignment to achieve that objective. Sure, you know what I can do is I can go to this slide here, and we can talk a little bit about how I would assess these objectives or these outcomes. So if I want students to leave the course with the ability to communicate with medical professionals about their health and the health of others, I would ask them to do some sort of assignment that would demonstrate their ability to explain and describe perhaps symptoms of disease, and to relate that to the content. Like, for example, if we're talking about a digestive system disease, I could ask them, okay, well, if you're going to be talking about ulcers, can you describe this using appropriate medical terminology and explain what this actually would mean for a patient in terms of their experience with the disease and also their treatment? The way that I've personally done this particular objective is with discussions, because it allows students to provide each other with additional questions that they may not have anticipated. When I have discussions about, they are effectively the medical professionals, right? They're the ones that are going to go into the medical field, allied health field, most likely. Forget the dog barking in the background. And they, having this ability to communicate with their peers is an opportunity to get to, one, demonstrate this learning objective, and also to get feedback from their peers about it, and to engage in the content in a meaningful way. Because often what happens is the students select, if it's the digestive system, they will select a digestive system disorder or disease that they themselves have experienced, or that their family members have experienced. And that adds that level of significant learning, the significant learning being the caring and the human dimension. And so that provides them with the chance to sort of more deeply engage with the content while addressing the learning objectives. And then the second one here, applying the understanding of physiological processes when making decisions about their health and the health of others. Case studies. Case studies would be a really good example. You provide students with a scenario person comes to the doctor, they describe these symptoms and diagnose it, like figure out what it is, figure out why they may be experiencing these symptoms based on your understanding of the physiology. So those are two examples of how this could work. If these were course level objectives, then a final project could be related to this, where they take one particular disorder that they've worked on over the course of the semester and integrate a deeper understanding of the physiological processes associated with that, the anatomical terminology associated with that, and then give a presentation on it to the class. Or create a portfolio or an Adobe Spark project or something like that. Did that help at all? Yeah, okay, thumbs up, cool.
Yes, thank you very much.
Yeah, no problem. Okay, so the last thing that I want to mention in here, as far as the use of backward design, Andy shared this with me, that the library has a guide about how students can use backward design to plan their research projects, which I think is phenomenal. So if you have already accessed this presentation, you can get right to that link. I'm going to stop my share right now so that I can share the link with you in the chat. Here it comes. Okay, and this is a Google site. And it describes, and if you want me to go through the share, I can, but ultimately it has a section demonstrating how students can use backward design to develop a research project, right? Identify your question, what are your goals with this research assignment, how are you going to demonstrate that you're meeting your goals, and then once again, filling in with the actual content after that. Andy, do you want to add anything to that?
I also just want to say, the website it has assignment ideas for faculty. So if you're looking for an alternative to a traditional multiple choice test, which we know is really measuring how well the student can take a multiple choice test rather than your learning outcomes, sometimes having different types of assignments to do your assessment can be helpful. And so there's some assignment ideas on one of the sections of that website.
Thank you very much, Andy. Yes, that's great. And I'm glad that you guys have some examples of how to do that there. We also, on the CRC online education resources site that Pat Cranley put together a couple years ago, we also have some resources and strategies for assessments in your online courses. And this includes suggestions for different types of authentic assessments. So we will, I think next spring, I can't remember our schedule exactly, but we will have a workshop on assessments. Andy, do you remember when we're doing that? I don't remember it. But anyway, the plan is we will talk about authentic assessment in a workshop. And so if you guys have any particular authentic assessments that you want to share, keep those and come back for that workshop. We're finishing up, I think right on time. Was this a 50-minute workshop? I can't remember. But if you guys have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. I'm going to stop the recording and thank everybody for coming. And if you have any questions about this, please don't hesitate to reach out and let me know.